Uh, so, just a quick reminder from last week, we found out that the unique characteristic or the special characteristic of humans in relation to other animals is that they are not just centric beings, but eccentric beings who are not just living out of their center, but living as their center by virtue of being posited into the positedness of their existence. They are posited into this executing, passing through of the mediate unity of their being. What this really means is that they can establish a relationship with their center and take a certain distance towards it, and in this process becoming a true I as a kind of through point of all their interiority. A human being is structured in a threefold manner. It is a body, as a living body, it is a body. As a life within this body, it is a lived body, and it is also a viewpoint from which it is both of these, and therefore he is a person. And similarly, corresponding to this threefold structure of the human of the human as a whole, he inhabits a world, not just an environment, but a world, which is also structured in this threefold manner as the outer, inner, and the shared world, which we're not going to go into, but we should probably touch upon in the discussion, because last time we weren't quite sure how to make sense of the notions like the spirit and the shared world. And maybe we have more strength to face these questions today. So the second part of this chapter is Plessner essentially trying to take these basic characteristics of the human, of this eccentrically positioned creature, being, and to try to derive three laws of anthropology which could explain the human in the widest breadth possible of the human's life. He comes up with a law of natural artificiality, the law of immediate immediacy, and the law of the utopian standpoint. The first kind of tries to say that because the human is structured the way he has to compensate via artificial work, which is kind of located in the sphere of culture. The second law says that he, being immanent in his consciousness, being always forced to mediate his always mediating his reality to himself, is in an indirect direct relationship, which has specific implications for the way the human expresses himself, and also for language as a kind of specification of expressivity. And then finally the law of the utopian standpoint, which essentially says that a human can't really find home. He can find the home he has lost. He can find a ground, and this leads him to these ideas, such as the idea of the absolute, of the God, of the totality, and at the same time of the contingency of both his world and himself, which he can only really at the end face with the help of certain social compromises which accommodate him, and on the other hand, via belief, by taking a leap of faith, as Plessner puts it. So to look first at this law of natural artificiality, we see the human has taken a relation towards himself. He is experiencing himself. He is experiencing his agency. And in this sense, he has this array of options of how he could act. But this also means that he knows he could have acted, he could always have acted differently than he actually does in practice. So in a certain sense, the human no longer has a defined way of life. He has no rule book given to him how he should act. He has no instincts that would help him to direct his course of actions, which means maybe I wanted to give this quote. Pico della Mirandola from the Renaissance times had this wonderful quote where he said that that God placed human at the midpoint of the world, and essentially told him that he gave him no specific identity, but that he should sculpt himself as into whatever shape he prefers. And this is kind of the destiny and the curse, and as well as the liberation of the human. He has become, in essence, a question to himself, and this is why I put the picture of the Sphinx, the Theban Sphinx, which asks what is the human, and this is the predicament of the human condition. He's always asking himself what he is and how he should act. Another formulation which Plessner offers here is that his being has become separate from his living. So the way he is alive doesn't contain his entire sphere of being, of how he is. And he calls this the Querlage of the human, or the sideways position. I think I translated because I'm always going through Slovene and then back into English. So to answer, given that he has this question, he has to answer it. He has to invent himself and make himself into whatever he is going to be. He has to be, to use a familiar term of Sartre's, he has to become his own project in a certain sense. And the way he has to figure out what characteristics does his way of living have to attain for this living to kind of become, in a certain sense, bearable, to find a sense of balance once again. As Plessner puts it, the human therefore lives only insofar as he leads a life. He has to make himself into what he already is to lead the life he lives. And we can see, even in the way Plessner phrases it, all these contradictions which are at work in the human condition. And this practical question, and it is ultimately a practical question, how to act, is at the root of all philosophy, Plessner says, which is asking how should a human live. It is at the root of all the various myths that the humans have invented for themselves to kind of explain how have we this lack of ours which we experience, this brokenness of ours which we experience. We're always looking back to find some kind of a golden age, a point where we did not experience ourselves in this particular manner, when we were not broken, a paradise of sorts, which we have been thrown out of. And Plessner says that it is actually, according to him, not quite possible to overcome this. And this is something we can really discuss. I think this is a very interesting point. Can this eccentric condition of the human ever be overcome in any kind of, for example, mysticism? Because the way Plessner puts it, not really. We can always kind of cover it up with certain traditions. We can muffle it, but we can't really make it go away. It will stay with us. And another familiar phrase is that Plessner uses that not only is human faced with this condition itself, he's very much aware of this condition. He knows that he is a naked being who has to compensate for his state, and is also ashamed of it. The human wants to escape the unbearable eccentricity of his being, Plessner says. He wants to compensate for the dividedness of his life form and find things which would be substantial enough to be able to counterbalance this weight of his own existence. And one important point which we should point to here is that this is not some specific additional psychological need which we are postulating. This is a need which is presupposed in all the other needs of the human. It is, as Plessner puts it later in the chapter, a pre-psychological ontic necessity, which is omnipresent throughout everything the human does. So we shouldn't just say this is like some extra drive or extra need we have. This is present in all the needs as it is. So how does the human answer his own question? Given the fact that he is the one giving this answer, that he is not finding it out there in some kind of a pre-built manner, certainly these answers cannot have this air of naturalness to them. They are not something organic. They are, as Plessner puts it, they are naturally artificial. So the human answers the questions of his existential condition by way of a detour of natural artificiality. This is how he stabilizes his existence, by creating various kinds of products, and not just products in this physical sense, but by this general artificial creative work with which he tries to reshape the world in such a manner as to accommodate it to himself. Now, at this point, Plessner criticizes the classic views of classic treatments of culture, both the spiritualistic view, which essentially reduces the culture to some kind of presupposed spiritual entity, or be it the mind or the spirit or just consciousness, but never really it fails to explain how this entity came to be constituted. And as Plessner finds, it's very much unsatisfactory. It's not good enough to just presuppose that some kind of spirit exists, and this is where culture comes from, and that's the end of the discussion. Neither, which essentially treat culture, and I think this is a view very much present in today's age, the view of culture as a kind of enhancement, a survival tool that focuses mainly on the functional parts of culture, but fails to look at the useless, in a certain sense, parts of culture. They fails to see the inner weight of the cultural sphere. And he doesn't like either the negative side of the naturalist camp, which is more the Freudian kind of camp, which treats culture as a compensatory mechanism, how the human, because of his overdevelopment, tries to deal with all the various derangements, essentially, which the human is faced with. And he has this Plessner has these very colorful passages where he describes the cerebral parasitism of the brain upon the human condition, which, using all these works of culture, we kind of try to face, whether it is via repression or sublimation and so forth. But this essentially just takes, usually these approaches take one particular symptom of the human condition, focus solely upon it. It's usually very much a pathological kind of view of culture, that culture is basically compensation for a pathology. And they usually neglect the more unpathological, functional aspect of cultural products. Both of these takes in the naturalist tradition are also, of course, very much reductionist. They are essentially deriving these categories from biology. And of course, as we know Plessner by now, he's very much opposed to this unreflected dichotomic approaches to the human, because they break the human apart into nature versus culture. And if we treat culture in this way, we've essentially missed the entire point of this enterprise in this book. They also fail to essentially answer the things, to explain the things they presuppose. For example, the fear of death. They don't explain why is it that the human fears death. They just assume that there is this omnipresent fear. Okay, or for example, why do we need to repress? Why does the human need to domesticate himself? Why is he so deranged? And this is what Plessner wants to capture with his notion of eccentric positionality and natural artificiality as the answer to it. It's not it's not necessarily something pathological. It is actually, this is how I phrase it to myself. This compensatory work, it is logical. It is simply what a human does, not as some kind of the response to a disease, but the way he lives his life. He goes by this detour of natural artificiality. He has to create these artificial products, traditions, art, which serve as mediating links post upon nature, and therefore kind of try to reintegrate stabilized existence. For culture, and therefore culture is neither. From this viewpoint, we can explain both the functional aspects of culture as well as the non-aspects of culture, as well as the inner weight of cultural objects. This is not just objects we're really talking about, because there's also obligations. There's this aspect of humanity that we're always putting obligations upon ourselves, trying to establish certain mores, traditions, by which we kind of want to guide our behavior, tell ourselves how to act. And all of these artificial products, in this wide sense, need to have a weight of their own. And this is a very interesting take from Plessner. They have these products. We can't recognize them to be these complete fabrications of ours. We have to kind of trick ourselves into thinking that we had found them. They're out there in the world, as though they were, in a certain sense, natural. Although action, it becomes clear to us that they are our own work. They have to appear as though they were divorced from their creator. And this is what gives them this inner weight of their own, and it is by this means that they are able to do this function of compensation for the eccentric being. This work, of course, never ends, and we will return to this in the third law of the utopian standpoint. We are always have to make new things. We always have to kind of try to, with a certain excessiveness, try to overcome what we've created before, and never quite being able to create this final product which would answer all questions. And now to move on to the second law of this mediate immediacy. We have to be careful with the terms here, as Plessner is. We've met this term before in the second chapter, where we talked about the immanence as a kind of derivation of the Cartesian dichotomy. But the difference this time is that we've not derived it from some kind of methodological assumptions, but from the very structure of life. So what is immanence? The human is given certain objects. We've talked about this in the previous, how he is able to have true objects shown as separable from the way they are given. They have a weight of their own. They exist in themselves. They have this character of being in themselves, and therefore never quite showing themselves fully. They only front a certain appearance of theirs which belongs to them. And this means that a human, whatever we know about the world, about the things of the world, and this includes both the inner and the outer world, we always know it by this mediation of the appearance of things. We don't know anything in itself, but always are mediating it via its appearance. We are always getting phenomena that do have this character of being in themselves, of being phenomena of something, but nevertheless phenomena. To put it shortly, the human is faced with the condition that he's getting only the contents of his consciousness. All that he has are these contents of the consciousness, and at the same time, he also, when he's perceiving things, he kind of forgets himself. He forgets himself as a subject. He gets the I, as Plessner puts it, the I gets lost in the seeing. So we have this interesting quandary. On the one hand, we are these centric animal close form beings which are facing reality in an immediate manner, but at the same time we have now said that we are always mediating this through our consciousness, only getting its appearances. Plessner says that it is only mediated by phenomena that the human knows of the appearing realities. Of course, the human may forget himself as a subject, but he does not forget himself as a human. He knows he has mediated this immediacy to himself. Even if we're looking at some object and kind of forget ourselves as a subject in this act, we are still, upon reflection, aware of the fact that this immediate experience of it was essentially mediated to ourselves by way of our eccentric positionality. So, in a certain sense, the human has discovered his immanence. He knows that he only gets these contents of consciousness. But on the other hand, this is what puts him in touch with reality. This is what gives him this hope that he is able, nonetheless, to get phenomena of something. Although he is only getting these contents of consciousness, only getting phenomena, he knows that these are phenomena of something. And what happens is essentially that this doctrine of immanence, of the human being caught within his own consciousness, confronts the doctrine of transcendence, Plessner says. The idealism of consciousness battles realism. What's important, particularly important, and I don't think I put it in the clearest manner here, because I'm always it's always a bit of a labyrinth to try to keep the things straight here, and we can return to this in the discussion. But I think the most important thing at this part is that the thing I find most interesting is that these epistemological problems that human faces of realism versus idealism, of indirect realism, direct realism, and what they are not some kind of methodological. They are in essence an condition the humans find themselves. But we can see that Plessner, on one hand, is not interested in kind of a monadological view of reality. So there's just this consciousness, nor is he being a naive saying that whatever intentionality gets its fangs upon, that this is actually what we are getting in touch with. And neither is he saying that we are making an inference of reality, so like some kind of an construction of it. So I'll move forward because there's much to go through yet. In essence, the human relationship to himself and to his world has this character of being a mediated immediacy, an indirect directness. I'm not sure why Plessner uses the two different terms. I'm not sure if this is something meaningful or if it just does it. Essentially, the human is still, of course, an animal in the closed form. He still, to a certain degree, lives from his center and has this immediate experience of reality. But this immediacy is actually mediated to him by way of being a human. Of course, yeah, maybe just a note that when we're talking about these mediate immediacy, these are not two separate relationships that a human has. They are the same relationship. They are one relationship, and in both of these relationships, both as an animal and as a human, the human is identical with himself. He's not one thing in one being in one case and another being in another case. Now, the human, in trying to compensate for his condition, in trying to cope with his condition, he's always creating, looking for new possibilities. Plessner tries to define creativity here or invention, essentially turning possibility, which will lead us to our next key term. He is trying to say all this creative work is essentially expressive. It is expressing the implicit possibilities given in the conditions of things. For example, he says the quest for something specific does not precede the invention, for whoever is looking for something in truth has already found it, which is a familiar biblical turn of phrase. And the expressivity he is looking at is not really any specific form of it. He's not looking just solely as language, as we might be misled to think. This is just an aspect which he looks at closer. But he's looking at expressivity in this more wider sense of a universal law of how humans live their life, how the human kind of life has this expressive character to it. And the question he is essentially answering with his theory of the eccentric positionality is, why does the human have to express himself? He expresses himself because he has to say as he tries to act in the world, as he tries to execute himself, as he lead his way, essentially are expressing these aspirations of his into the world. So he's trying to take outside, finds to be within. He's trying to shape this transient interiority of his, and to give it some kind of permanenter shape. Now, of course, this means that if we want this process of a kind of this externalization, of this expression, that we can either look at consciousness as a kind of hermetically closed box, because then if we were closed within our consciousness, it would be impossible to express anything out. On the other hand, not consciousness is not some kind of mere lens, which would mean that essentially would go against this idea of immanence. If we simply had an easy access to a world which was obviously standing before us. And of course, the consequence is that all the human's expressions are never quite perfect. They always have to get, in a sense, translated from this, from inside outside, and they always, because the body, the soul, the spirit are heterogeneous, Plessner says, they always kind of break apart as they hit the medium into which they are being expressed. So this medium, this, I don't know, general space, whatever we are trying to express ourselves into within, is not completely malleable. We can't do exactly what we want. It is not just mere material which we could shape and bend to our whims, because if we could, then there will be no negativity, no resistance to the process, and therefore no real pleasure and no sense of fulfillment. So we have this intention, this aspiration, which we are trying to express, which we are trying to realize, and we would feel no fulfillment in this process if everything was simply if we could simply express everything with zero resistance. And on the other hand, if the medium was, as Plessner puts it, a wayward medium, which would kind of constantly resist our attempts to expression, and mean essentially that we would never quite succeed at expressing, we could also not talk about being able to experience any kind of fulfillment. We would not be able to fulfill our intentions, and we would not be able to truly express ourselves. To speak of fulfillment, we need neither the direct relationship nor the indirect relationship, but we need the indirect direct relationship, which we've talked about already. So whatever we are expressing, we need this sense that although as we are expressing, we have a direct relationship to this object of our expression, eventually we begin to see it as not something that is coming from here, from me, but as coming from there, from out there, as though similarly to the cultural artificial products that we talked about before, that is found out there. So, and that is separated from us, that is breaking apart from us. Put it shortly, whatever reality the human arrives at as he is trying to mediate his way through it, as he is trying to express himself, it is a reality which is a compromise, and it's a compromise between him and the reality in itself, and all of his expressions are similarly a compromise. You never can quite express exactly what you wanted to say. You always kind of come close to it, but there's always this sense of imperfection, which leads us to try again and again. And this process of the human trying again and again to express himself and all the other things is essentially what Plessner calls history. What is the role of language? To touch upon that shortly, is that it is essentially expressivity squared. It lets us express this structure of our immanence. It lets us objectify it in these propositional meanings out of which it is built. In a certain sense, language expresses the indirect relationship par excellence, because it refers to things in a manner which is neither purely indirect, neither purely direct. And consequently, given what we've said about this expressivity, its imperfection, we can also never quite say that we could find a proto-language. This is always an interesting discussion point, that we cannot find language as a form separate from content, as a kind of code, an initial code of language that we could that would always be the same, because form is always, in a certain sense, except in reflection, of course, but in the process of expression, form is indivorcible from the content of expression, and as such, all language is, in a certain sense, maybe in a in a more Varelian, all language is languaging. It is in the process. It is in the breaking into idioms that we can really talk about language. And now to finish up with the final law, and which is called the utopian standpoint, although what it promises is not really quite utopian, it is more dystopian, we might argue. The human being incomplete, being constantly forced to try to stabilize himself, can actually never quite reach this goal. The moment we think we have reached our goal, that we have reached the final destination, Plessner says the human within him has already gone beyond. We try to attain things, but we can never quite get to them. We try to find home, we try to find our roots, but because of the way our form of life is structured, we can never quite find it. We are constitutively rootless, homeless, baseless, based on nothing, living in a no place. So utopos. This, I think, is the kind of one of the bases of the name of this law. But of course, the idea of groundlessness kind of leads us to this idea of a ground, the idea of rootlessness to the idea of a root, the relative to an absolute, and eventually the human begins, the idea of a restless being to a being that is at rest, so to an absolute, to a God. And in the end, we see that the human condition is such that in the end he has to believe in all the various manifestations of this belief. Religion essentially gives this definitivum, as Plessner puts it. It offers us this ground upon which we can base ourselves. It lets us integrate ourselves into the world and helps us face this fate of ours. A religion which is nonetheless not compatible with culture. This is another important point, because the spirit, Plessner says, always leads us away from home. So religion tries to we try to believe and ground ourselves, but the human nature is such that we're always, again, looking away, looking into the horizon and moving away from this home into which we've stabilized ourselves. So to skip some of the less important points, and to really get into these final formulations, the eccentric being, the human, is essentially a walking contradiction. He is an insoluble contradiction. He, on the one hand, eccentricity, we've found, gets him in touch with the world. On the other hand, it is exactly eccentricity which puts him at this insurmountable distance from the world. He is an eccentric being who is trying to realize itself. Is in a certain sense an eccentric center. So of course he can never quite realize himself completely. The notion of an eccentric center, Plessner says, remains an absurdity, even if it is realized. So we are always looking for this support. We're trying to objectify our reality into a totality, which would be a unified world again. And on the other hand, we are faced with this dilemma that on the one hand, as individuals, in the here and now, we are irreplaceable, but in the shared world, in the spirit, in the we form that we talked about last time, we are the same as everyone else. There's nothing that really makes us special. So the human is, in a certain sense, ashamed of his replaceability, Plessner says. We are not really that important, we might simplify. And this kind of haunts us, because we see ourselves as these special individuals, but we know that in the grand scheme of the human world, we are really nothing special. Everyone could take our place. And to deal with this, this has important implications for the way we structure our social lives. We want to structure it in a certain way that does not do violence to life, that respects us, our individuality, and yet limits it to a sufficient degree. And here Plessner kind of refers to his previous work, The Limits of Community, which we discussed in the beginning, in which he essentially made this argument, and here he repeats it, that communal life, this collectivist vision, in which the individual is completely subservient to the collective, is essentially unworkable for the modern human because it essentially crushes him. So yeah, atheism is easier said than done, as Plessner says. We might aspire for atheism. We might try to. We would, if someone had come up, and I think this is a brilliant turn of phrase, if someone had come up with this perfect ontological proof of God, we would do everything to try to disprove it. This is kind of contra what Voltaire said in the opposite direction. We're always looking for an anchor, always trying to stabilize ourselves, unify ourselves and our world, and kind of regain this lost paradise which we think we must have lived at some point. But of course, this paradise can only be believed in. And now for the this was just my conclusion. I think since we're so few, we don't have to go through it all. There's the basic points throughout the book that we've covered. Some of the questions which crossed my mind, one which I've picked up from last time, is what's the relation between the shared world and the spirit? I'm still not quite clear upon that. I'm not sure Plessner is either. Some questions which are more general and not specific to this chapter is, for example, has Plessner in fact avoided the Cartesian dichotomy, the dualism which he set out to avoid in the beginning? Can we imagine artificial intelligence according to Plessner's conception of life? Is his idea of life really just limited to life, or can we imagine other kinds of entities which would fit these criteria? What is the role of the absolute in modern times? I think that's a very important question, and related to the political questions which we started with. I think we're kind of all yearning for an absolute in this form or another. And one which has fascinated and irritated me for quite some time is this idea of what role does mysticism play, which also has these ideas of centering or finding unity, of finding this point of rest. Is mysticism a centering, which would in a sense be a return to a more animal form of life, or is it beyond? Is it a degree higher? And this is just something I think would be interesting to discuss. This is for everything from my side. Hope it was reasonably clear.
Very good. Very good. Very good. Okay, I think this was very clear. One thing, maybe one observation that I would like to share with all of you is now that we've gone through the book, and this is something that I've kind of was thinking about already after my first reading. I have the impression that Plessner knew where he wanted to start the book and where he wanted to end the book. I'm not sure he knew that much about the middle ground. And I think that, for example, the way he phrases initial chapters and the last chapters, where you can see that he can be very clear to the point that he's making, like, for example, this particular chapter, it's brilliantly written, extremely interesting, well developed. You can see how he criticizes different points of view and then builds up his own position against the background of these opposing views. But I think that he didn't really know what to do with the middle part. So when he was building up, from the phenomenon of life as such, and then through all the stages up to the animal and the human, so that the organ parts and whatnot. I think that that was like a later attempt to make some sort of a bridge. But yeah, that's just the
Yeah,
impression I got.
I feel like you constantly have to do this for him. Like try to see how did he get from this point to that point? How does this
Mm.
chapter connect to the next one?
But he
And
was
then it makes
definitely not
sense.
deducing. He was definitely, so, you know, he starts off like, I'm going to deduce, yeah. I'm going to do some sort of a deduction method. He was not deducing. He knew where he wanted to come. He knew where he wanted to start, but boy, he did not deduce. So yeah, that's and it's a pity, like I said, two meetings ago, that most people give up before they come to the best parts of Plessner. It's he can get so dense, so difficult, that before you get to the animal and humans, like with our group, people just stop. You know, they just kind of give up. They just, this is too much. I can't handle it. I can't handle Plessner anymore. So, and it's summer, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a pity. That's such a pity, because you can get so much from these last chapters,
Yeah.
especially this last one. This is just fascinating. Like, there's so much wealth in it. You could basically have the whole reading club just for these two last chapters. Anyway, these are just some remarks of a more general nature. So maybe we can start with more concrete questions. Pretty sure Letitia and Phil have some good questions or remarks.
Oh, thanks, Primoz. It was very good again. I have a lot of questions, the same as I had before, and some more related, for example, to this idea of expressivity and expression. I was thinking about, again, the first person methodologies. We talked about this last week. So in this case, I had the impression, for example, this expressivity is related to actualization, this passage from the possible to actualization. So there is a transformation, and it's imperfect. So it's not like if we were representing something from this inner world, something, it's different. It's an invention or a creation of something, right? Or
it's a translation. I think this captures kind of the dynamic. Just like in a linguistic translation, you can never quite capture all the elements of the original. Something gets lost in the wayward medium, but still you do get some of the what, even if the how of it is more problematic.
But I think that here you have like these two distinctions that he's talking about. So there you have the expression within the realm of the already constituted meanings. So within the realm of the prevailing symbolic meanings within a given culture. And then you have the expression where you're basically trying to articulate something for the first time. So when you're literally constituting a new symbolic domain, there you don't really have this. So the translation parallel is a really good one, because it captures nicely, precisely how you can convey something, but you never really completely convey it. So even if it's like a very trivial thing, still it's like there's like even maybe a 0.1% of something that is kind of, you know, but there are also moments where you have to bring forth within the conditions that are given to you something that provides for a radically novel meaning. And here you don't have that. Here what you have is literally like attention within the realm of the possible, and then the attempted articulation, which becomes fulfilled only when it is done. That's when you say, that's it, you know, that's it. Like there was just something, and in retrospect, you can say, yeah, this is what I was thinking about, but I couldn't really articulate it. But you never really had even that first. So where's the difference between the two analogies? When you translate from English to Slovene, you understand the English. And even if you see the Slovene has a slightly different dissonance, in the first time, you don't have the element, you don't have the English original. You just have a certain something that you have a certain motion, you have a certain direction. but you don't really know what it is until it becomes manifested. That's the birth of the novel meaning. But Letitia, so how does this relate to the you were probably referring more to these types, or were you referring to the other ones, to the one that Primož was saying, where you already have the constituted meanings?
I actually I have this question because I see the difference, and sometimes in the first person methodologies, for example, these microphenomenological interviews, we don't necessarily make this difference clear, and I think there are both things happening in these microphenomenological interviews.
For sure, yeah. If somebody has an aha moment, or if somebody has some sort of an illumination or an insight or recognition, that's precisely the second thing that you do. So in Merleau-Ponty, he has an interesting, he talks about the speaking speech and the spoken speech. The speaking speech is the speech where you get the constitutive element. The spoken speech is where you're kind of already moving within the realm of the constituted to a certain degree.
Yes, sometimes in the microphenomenological interviews, we will say that this is the expression of the pre-reflexive or the pre-reflected domain. But I'm not sure if it's exactly the same here.
Yeah, the problem with this pre-reflective in these approaches is that it has become one of those black boxes that they just kind of use it. You usually don't really know what it means. So they want to say it's not subconscious, but neither is it fully conscious. So in Plessner, you have this transition from the possible or tacit to explicit, and something similar is at work in Merleau-Ponty. So I find this very useful because the structure of the possible is different than the structure of the actual and the explicit. And interestingly enough, Whitehead plays on the same role of the possibility and how it actualizes itself or realizes itself. So, yeah.
But in this case, also in Plessner, there is this invention or actualization. There's not only the expressions, also invention, not only the representation of something that was already there. Right?
Yeah,
because
for sure.
It's related to
it's always an actualization. It's always, even if it's trivial, but it's only to a lesser degree. So for the most part, when we talk, I don't know if I see Primož after a really long time and we started chatting about what's up, what's been going on. Like we're moving in these predetermined sedimented meanings. We don't really, like there will always be slight modifications. Primož will add something, I will add something, but in general, like there isn't a lot of, you don't even notice that this is happening. Yeah, it's more on the horizon or in the background. But when you're actually trying to convey a certain something, this is where it happens more clearly, where you're kind of constantly in this process of giving birth to a certain something. So, but I don't know, Primož will remember more. So it is like this constant interaction between, like, I give birth, but it's not ex nihilo, because when I do it, I say, yeah, this is it. So, it's almost like the world beckons. So I want to do something and the world provides an opportunity. If this happens, like if this meeting happens, then it works. So again, it's really difficult to say. I mean, I did it, but after a while, the world has to provide an anchorage, and it says the same. It says the thing back to me. It is only then that I know it. Yeah. So it's almost like I throw something out, and only when I hear the echo, if I hear the echo, it works. I don't know what I threw out completely. Like I just have a feeling I threw out something, but I don't. It's perhaps a useful, very simple, trivial example is I'm struggling with an idea, and then I write it down, and in the process of writing, I say, yeah, this is it. This is it. but I didn't. It's like naive to say that this idea was there, yeah. So I can do it retrospectively once it's already constituted. But the fact of the matter is it only came to being through the act of actualizing itself.
Mhm.
He never uses the language of intentionality of note, but is this where would this be helpful? I mean, I know this is where I'm sort of thinking in terms of Husserl and others, is saying that the intentionality of our acts of knowing in some ways would be constitutive, but it's going out, it's reaching out to something here, and at least I'm hearing something like that going on here, but he doesn't use this vocabulary. So
He does talk about intending consciousness. So
Mhm.
I think he's kind of almost there by just using the term everyone else uses, but doesn't quite say explicitly intentionality. When he talks about how, on the one hand, we are intend certain things, unconsciousness does intend certain objects. So it is intentional, I think, as far as he's concerned.
Mhm.
But it
Mhm.
has also this the transcending aspect of consciousness, which is opposed to the intending part. And also he has this image of I think it's knowledge. It's an English translation. How it reaches as a ray into the world and picks, in a certain sense, certain things up and then returns to the object, to the subject. So I think he does have this implicit, at least.
Yeah, well, that's what I was hearing, and it seemed somewhat similar to views I've been getting from Husserl and others, but yeah,
Maybe Phil, what the thing is that one of the main differences I think here is that for Plessner, like pure acts of intentionality as such would be problematic, because you do not constitute in the sense of, for example, I just kind of have this show and I see an object and it's there. So there's always an element of expressivity that is present. So I actually have to constitute a certain something by getting involved. So I have to throw myself, and when I live among objects in the cultural world that I inhabit, sure, I can pretend that I'm doing Husserlian phenomenology. But when I witness the birth of a new meaning, I see that just pure intentionality doesn't work like that. So it involves
good.
Yeah, it involves my basically having to throw myself out, and only if I land on something, if the world provides the landing place, is there a new domain of meaning that I can then describe in those terms in retrospect.
That's helpful. Very, very good. Very good.
He actually does use the term intentionality.
Yeah. Intending intentionality. It's in contrast to reflecting, right? So you have a reflective.
There he uses intending, but I think on the same page he actually explicitly of intentionality. He says
What
he
page is that? Let's see if we can look at that. What page is that?
306.
306.
My
pages are good. I put a quote in the chat, by the way.
Oh yeah, here I've got it. I actually have it noted in my own notes here. Let's see.
Yeah,
so in general, he talks about the tension between reflective attitude and the intending attitude. So intending attitude is what absorbs you into the world. The reflecting attitude always kind of splits you up. And he basically says that if you take on board the eccentricity of the human being, you can account for both without having to go either way.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's he otherwise he tries to, as we've noticed last time, avoid all the familiar kinds of ways of talking about it. He just kind of drops these notions here, but it doesn't dwell too much on it. And in general, I know when I was trying to compare with Varela, he talks very little about cognition specifically as some kind of as though he doesn't want to really go to that level of discussion. He's not really interested in isolating cognition as some kind of ghost in the machine. It just really stays on the level of the whole living being, of the organism.
Mm. I think that partly the reason for this is that basically the trajectory of the German thought, when it was talking about the questions of life, mind, and spirit, was actually traversing different domains than contemporary philosophy of mind. And I think that there are several problems, because when people nowadays talk about cognition, you cannot really easily project it into some of these frameworks. So there's like a problem. It's a huge problem about how do you, so the problem of translation, pretty much, basically, how do you translate from one framework into another? And the notion of cognition in general is just a very tricky one, one thing that I was thinking about when you posed the question about could there be an artificial intelligence structured along the lines of Plessner, I think that a very interesting Plessnerian point of view would be that basically the whole project of constructing artificial intelligence, whereby you're basically using the central notion of cognition as the key thing that you're trying to artificially create, is problematic. Because for Plessner, the eccentricity is an existential structure. It is the mode of being, not the way you think. But at least with the classical artificial intelligence, you were basically trying to build a symbolic machine that would be able to do an eccentric type of thinking. And for Plessner, this is basically a no-go. So what he would say is the only way you could get to the artificial eccentricity is not through artificial intelligence, but through artificial life. If you manage to capture the logics of life artificially, the dynamics that he's talking about, then you might get to eccentricity eventually. But if you have like a certain something and you just want to implement a layer of cognition that would be able to do this, this is kind of missing the point. It doesn't work this way. Already this, for example, the classical computer has zeros and ones. So in a certain sense, it can be either 1 or 2, but never neither 1 or 2. But this is precisely what Plessner requires. It requires you to be able to take on the position where you're kind of living the two realms. So, the
a machine can't be a walking contradiction.
Yes, precisely.
It has to be resolved, or it doesn't work.
It is one of the crucial so it is one of the essential characteristics of the machine, precisely not to be paradoxical, whereas according to Plessner, this is a sine qua non if you want to have eccentricity. It is the price you have to pay to be able to have a reflective attitude.
So the answer is no.
The answer is no. Yeah, but it's a complicated no. It takes the question to the relationship between intelligence and life. So
because I suppose that this might be related. I don't really know the discussion so well, but this might be related to the question of what kind of stuff can we make artificial life out of, and this is where all the typical chip-based approach might be misguided, because the material is not structured in such a way as to be unable to be contradictory. It is already implicit in the material that it has to be structured in a way which resolves the contradiction so that the mechanism works.
Yeah, or maybe just the what is it, like the Boolean paradigm? Yeah, the Boolean paradigms of zeros or ones is maybe problematic. So that's maybe why, for example, the robots that were structured like these dumb robots that were just bumping into stuff and then learning to do things from that, they were closer to this type of approach, because they started literally from the level of life, even though they weren't talking about it. They were still talking about artificial intelligence, but within in the introduction of neural networks, for example, and the complex systems, you get a different way of doing stuff that is closer to the logics of life than it is to the logics of the classical intelligence, so to speak. So even though we still use the same label, it's a bit misleading, because you basically are starting to a certain degree a different type of project. It's not necessarily radical, like the radicality of this newness is not necessarily profound enough. So maybe, you know, another step needs to be taken, but it's literally a different project that you're doing. So
sweet.
Yeah.
You mentioned at one point, and I mentioned that question of lensing rather than representation in some of the analysis here. I mean, in some discussions I've said, it was particularly trying to explain some of Husserl's saying is that you have to see the question of perception as more of a lensing rather than one of representing images on a screen in this way. And yet I think you, Primož, I think you denied at one point that would be a useful analogy, the notion of lens rather than representation. Did I hear you correctly on that?
Yeah, I think that he basically cancels both of two different metaphors, right, Primož? One is the lens.
Yeah. You can answer it, because I'm just trying to find my place.
No,
in the
I'm
notes.
also trying to find. Yeah, I'm also looking for the. I can't find the.
Yeah, 301 seemed to be talking about that, but it was. Let me just get.
Yeah, he talks about a lens and a box. So both of these are problematic. So neither is consciousness a box. So this would be the idea of representation, basically.
That's true.
But neither is it a lens.
That's right. Let's read.
That's on 309.
Yeah.
309. Okay.
309. Yes.
I guess.
Okay, good. Yeah, I've got. In fact, I have a note in the margin exactly on that passage.
Yeah.
And
he doesn't like the box nor the lens.
Yeah.
I guess it depends how you conceive of the lens. But I mean, I guess you can look at the lens as a kind of a filter, and you try to point to you use this metaphor to signal this more an activist idea that you never get the world quite in the way it is, but it's always kind of mediated. I'm always already using Plessnerian language. It's always mediated by way of yourself. But let me see how. I'm not sure what exactly Plessner minds about it.
I don't remember, but I have vaguely recall, or maybe this is just a post hoc reconstruction. A box is a representation. Yeah, so you're in a box where you're enclosed in your representations. A lens is the opposite, where you basically look through lens into something. So even though a lens can change something, like, you know, we can magnify, but still you have a direct access. For him, both of these are problematic.
Yeah, so that's where that was the issue that was because the first one could be you might say in the traditional empiricist way, it's a passive view. You have sense impressions come into a box and play upon a screen. The other being a more dynamic view, which is, you know, the consciousness itself extending and then outward. But he clearly seems, he says he said it destroys, this is on 309, the essential connection between immanence and expressivity is incomprehensible to a view that thinks of consciousness merely as a lens placed in front of the eye of the body and the eye of the spirit and placed at the end. Yeah, and he's clearly denying that. And
I think what he's saying is that it's not a simple lens. It's not like a window that we're looking through directly into the world.
Yes.
I think this is what he's arguing
Precisely.
against.
Yeah,
here.
that's the point. So the first one is basically a critique of idealism. The second one is the realism. So because realists would say, well, sure, there are some distortions, like a lens would distort to a certain degree, but still you have a direct access to the world. So for him, the appearance doesn't work like that. So it is the appearance of a thing gives you the thing, but it doesn't give it in a way where through the thing you would immediately get the thing itself, but neither does it completely bar you off from the thing. So it just is a certain manifestation that calls for a further exploration, so to speak. And basically, it is by your response that you can approach the thing while never fully, well, in a certain sense, you immediately grasp it, but you also never exhaustively grasp it.
Exactly.
Immediately grasp.
No, I mean, that's interesting, because I mean that you're trying to think through this. I mean, you say what you're calling a realist, something like an Aristotelian view, where you grasp the form through simply reaching out, even though you can have that the senses can transmit that, but nonetheless it's reaching out. And he's trying to work someplace in between that, and he says and it's critical with the connection between immanence and expressivity. Only by taking the roundabout way via the emotions, interests, and actions with the contents of contemplation acquire reality as, according to, as it were, priority of the practical, that it occupies the middle ground between primacy established by Kant and that established by pragmatism. But then he says, this view, however, loses sight of the indirectness and brokenness of everything that is centrifugal, and thus of the specific structure of expressivity characterizing human manifestations of life. Now he's trying to give us, it seemed to be another, and I'm just really trying to get hold of where his position is coming down here, because I think that's, and how he's trying to mediate between certain kinds of views of both representation and direct realism here.
Yeah, well, the thing is that he's taking this position where it is of the nature of the things that they give themselves through aspects while never being fully accessible in that way. This is what he means when he says that things have their own weight or their own density. So, Phil, it's like when you look at a book, you always see it from a certain perspective. And regardless of how, whatever I do with the thing, I never really can exhaust it. I will never get to its core, and I will never see it as full. So, and it can always surprise you. It can always surprise me. The world can always surprise me. It can kind of, it has horizons that I haven't really been able to cap. So even though I'm accessing the thing, it has a thickness that is for a human being inexhaustible. So in a specific context, this book might become something that will play a completely different role, and it is basically, you might say, possibly present in it tacitly, but it can only manifest itself in a specific context, and the world shows it to me in the sense of, I don't know, it's difficult for me to come up with a good idea, but I don't know, maybe this book in some weird context might save me life, because we have a Nazism part 2, and the general who comes to pick me up is a fan of Plessner. Yeah, so all of a sudden this book like has a completely new like a dimension to it that is just, or maybe a different example of this sort would be, for example, this is more directly related to the expressivity. So where you can see, how this manifests itself in how they express things. So let's say that I'm the first person who came up with a car, with a functioning model of a car. Yeah. And then somebody might say, well, this was an invention by Sebastian Wörsch. He created the car. So the car is basically nothing but the projection of Sebastian Wörrich's work, but
Okay.
check this out. So I was actually, the only thing that I was trying to develop was a certain something that could get me from A to B quickly. However, in the course of next 50 years, this car will, because of its nature, restructure the landscape of the towns and cities we live in. It will become not only a means of transportation, but also a social symbol. It might have something that gets integrated into the way we court and try to pick up someone, hit up on someone or stuff like that. So all of a sudden, through the course of these 50 years, dimensions of a car starts developing and unraveling that have their own life, which go beyond what my original intention was. So the car has its own gravity, its own depth. And it is this depth that starts influencing even the author himself. So in this case, me, I did not expect that, having a car will maybe, I don't know, get me a nice lady, or that it will cause most of the towns to become completely different than they are. So there is a certain depth of the thing that you can never get into it, and it's not just about physical things, that have a certain depth, but the cultural things themselves. So they start living a life of their own.
But can we have? I was thinking if there is a evolution or progression. I don't know. Can we have more or less access to these meanings or these effects? Is there a correlation between this being decentered and having more meanings, or having access to more meanings? Or
well, I think that an interesting example would be schizophrenics, where you have meaning everywhere. But I think that here the problem is that the meaning is unilateral. So you don't have an equilibrium. So that the world doesn't speak
something
back.
that we were discussing last week, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly. If can we say that there are different degrees of decentering or eccentricity in humans themselves? Can we develop?
I think so. I think that this is also related to what Primož was asking about the mystics and contemplatives.
Yeah.
But
using your example of the book, I mean, we have a whole set of primary meanings, but we could also use it at a doorstop, or it could stop a bullet. That could be subordinate uses or meanings of this, but yet there's a certain fundamental primary meaning that we would attribute to a book. And I think that's what Letitia is asking, sort of a hierarchy of what would be.
Or a capacity to take into consideration certain effects. We can have more or less consideration or care about the effects of things.
Could you spell this out?
I'm not sure, but for example, inventing a car, you can just consider this capacity to take you from A to B, but before inventing, you can consider other things too.
Yeah, that's true. But the thing is, like, look, this is an interesting case, what you're saying. So, for example, this is something that is now being slowly integrated into the scientific work, because we have had these examples where we have created a certain something which has led then to completely unintended consequences. So scientists are now kind of trying to make it a principle where they would actually try to actively look for alternative meanings. I'm not sure to what degree this is possible. And even if it is, once this is integrated into the practice, the results that will be produced might have additional depth that will bring up something unintended, and we will have to address this. So even if
it's always imperfect, but we can.
So you can add a certain layer to it, so it becomes more complex and thereby changes. So the products will be different because you will integrate this particular thing into that. But when they get created, again, they will have a meaning of their own, which will probably require some further.
Yeah, I see that. But I was thinking, I don't know if it's absurd, but in animals, in animals, there is a more direct relation with things. So no consideration of the consequences of the acts. And in humans, it's more mediated, so we can consider more consequences.
Yeah, but here's the problem. The biggest problem that I think with this is that whenever you have the domain of futurity, it is in the realm of possible and implicit. So I'm not sure that you can, from this particular standpoint, articulate the ways that you and the world will be able to meet. Because it has to go into the world so that the world changes and world provides new opportunities for you to see. So I don't think that this is doable. This is I think that I don't know, maybe it is, maybe with like, a lot of projecting or something. I don't know, but it's such a complex process. I really don't see that you can anticipate to this degree, because it would actually require you to explicate all the possibilities in advance, where every explication opens new possibilities. But you would have to basically do like, okay, we do this, and then these new possibilities will open up. And how can you know this? Like, if you know this, then the possibilities are no longer possibilities, but are actually already actuality. So if you've done this, yeah, I don't know. I think it's very problematic. I think.
Yeah.
Any other views on this?
Yeah, it's trying to get getting clear on the kind of realism that there is here that he's getting at, that also has this feedback dimension to it. I'm finding interesting, but I haven't quite fully articulated myself. But and in some ways it has a way of getting around some of the tendency to just kind of which you get in Husserl, to a kind of idealism of consciousness that is always a problem, it seems, in some of Husserl's discussion that he's moving past. What I'm really interested in trying to get at is how does this flesh out as an anthropological project? And I think that's what he's trying to lay, is the foundations of an anthropological project here in this philosophical anthropology. And maybe that's another book that he's written that we haven't read, but yeah, but is that, does anyone have an answer to that? I mean, if you were to sort of try to summarize what you think is the anthropological project emerging from this.
I mean, if we go back to the first chapter, the problem we were faced with is that all the existing methods ultimately break the human apart into, on the one hand, a natural being, and on the other hand, a cultural being. So we are never quite able to piece together what, for example, I don't know, biology is finding out and what sociology is finding out. We have always a human of two different, seemingly incommensurable types.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
From the viewpoint of an anthropology, which tries to look at the human person as a unified kind of object of study, I suppose, but also as the subject of study in a certain sense, we can't tolerate these dichotomies. And I think what Plessner tried to do here, and I do think he did manage it, although it's difficult in the middle parts, he tried to derive a notion of the human without calling up these old presumptions of dualisms. He developed it, he deduced him from these basic notions of life, from the boundary, from positionality. And now we, in this final chapter, we're finally looking at what makes the human more specifically human, for example, in culture. And the understanding of culture, which he offers here as the sphere of naturally artificial products, is essentially an understanding which calls for no we don't have to introduce dualism at this point. We don't have to introduce some kind of disembodied spirit which suddenly emerges with the coming of the human form. It's again, it's an attempt to deduce directly from an understanding of life, which is not thought of dichotomously, but as I suppose essentially monistically in a certain way, and try to give us his take on culture from this on this ground. And I think this is actually quite fascinating because
yeah, it is.
A lot of the classical approaches, they usually make, for example, when I was comparing with Varela, what he essentially did with and Maturana in the Tree of Knowledge, what they essentially did, they also tried to kind of deduce culture from a notion of life, from their definition of life, but they essentially stopped at what Plessner calls this more functionalist, naturalistic view of culture as a set of tools for survival. And I don't think that captures culture in the whole, and it doesn't capture culture objects in their own weight. And this is what I think Plessner manages. He gets this part, and he also gets the other part without ever explicitly wading into a dualism, or at least that's what he thinks.
I think that
the question is, of course, does he have to?
That's very good, and I think very helpful, because I'm trying to just thinking about this is particularly coming back from how does this integrate even with some of our scientific understanding, for instance, an evolutionary view of the human. I mean, that leads us so much of the time into sociobiological explanations of everything human that is sort of the stock and fare of so much of Anglo-American discourse. But I think that that his focus on, I sent out that little article. I said it's an article. It wasn't really a long discussion by Strauss, who's coming out of the same you might say philosophical world that he was writing in. But this notion of his, the emergence, however it is, of eccentric positionality, that to which he's trying to attach so much of this cultural analysis and the human sphere, that I think Plessner, to me, that's a very interesting and important insight, and it goes much deeper than the kind of analysis that we can see given by Strauss. But I think that they're making some of the same, certain kind of the same points, is to pay attention to certain aspects there, that what it is that makes the human and the cultural, that isn't really just emerging into some kind of a dualism. And I think that's the traditional problem we were trying to overcome here. But at least that's some of the things I'm getting out of this, is a you might say an anthropological project that would be of interfacing with some of the kind of more empirical anthropological work people are doing, and so forth. But
yeah, so what Primož was saying, actually, so Plessner nicely summarizes this idea when he basically provides a very short summary of his critique of both the naturalist and the spiritualist accounts of human being on page 293. And this is what he says. It's very simple and very straightforward. This is their cardinal error, so the cardinal error of these two approaches, which strikingly demonstrates their inability to see from one perspective, and he emphasizes one, from one perspective, the human as human, and at the same time as a creature of nature, as long as they merely combine ideas derived from natural sciences with ideas from the humanity. So basically what Primož was saying, the idea was to come up with a project that would allow you to on the one hand, account for the specificity of human beings, so without necessarily reducing the human to the animal, and without necessarily ending up in a position where you completely sever the domain of the spirit from the natural. And in doing so, you need to So for Plessner, as for many authors like Strauss, and also on the other hand, for authors very different, such as Whitehead, for instance, you can't really have this happening on the cheap. So, it's not just like we need to just naturalize teleology, as some people now do.
Yeah.
Like it's completely naive. First of all, what the heck does that even mean? That's one thing. And the second of all, it's not just, you don't just need teleology, right? You need an account as to how this is possible then. So
Yeah.
And I think in relation to that, when he's saying, it's kind of opposing the view that we've sucked culture out of our thumbs, I think that kind of relates to that. Yes, so okay, at some point we developed tools, and now suddenly we have culture.
yeah.
We need to look at the actual genesis of culture, not as some kind of accumulation of tools, but a sphere of its own, with its own laws and its own characteristics.
Precisely. So he thinks that, for example, the pragmatist account can say, well, we kind of eventually started developing tools. Well, these tools are just, in a certain sense, your own inventions and your own extensions, but they lack precisely the depth and the weight that is required if these tools are to become cultural symbols that not only are governed by you, but eventually start governing you reciprocally, so to speak, or to the point where they are beyond you. You're thrown into the world of symbols that show you the way to live or the possibilities to lead your life. So yeah, I mean, the thing that he does in these last few chapters are actually quite brilliant. So again, a huge pity that most people couldn't make it this far.
Yeah, we would. I'm going to have to cut off, but we were talking
we
possibly having another final session. Maybe we can get everybody else back involved on this.
Okay.
But
Okay.
because I found the appendix was interesting, how he was trying to update some of this, deal with some of the more recent work and so forth. But this is, because I think I've just been really worthwhile to kind of keep with it. And I've got to go back and reread the whole thing and see if I can digest it again. But it's
sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, that's right. No,
We've all invested so much time in this.
And it's worthwhile to work through a book with this kind of patience. The group we had before was trying to do way too much too soon. And everybody, this was a loss, but this has been very good pace.
Yeah, I agree. So okay, let's wrap this up in the following manner. I would suggest, Phil, that you keep us posted about your plans or availability about presenting the appendix. Maybe we can do it, I don't know, even in September or something like that, because during the summer I think that people,
everybody gets gone. That would be good. That would be good timing.
And then we can also maybe have like a more open general discussion about Plessner. So not without necessarily going into specifics, but about the book as a whole, any parallels we might draw with certain other authors or works, and also maybe do a little bit of brainstorming about if we want to do something with this in the future, like something concretely in the form of either papers or something, that might actualize itself from this domain of possibility that we've opened up.
Yeah, very good. Well, excellent. It's been an excellent. Thank you for organizing this and keeping us on track. So I'm sorry I've got to leave right now, but
we will also go, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
So everybody, be well.
Okay. Take care.
We'll stay in touch for the appendix part. Yeah? Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.